In A Violent Nature review, a gory and artistic slasher with a brilliant hook, Gus Van Sant's Death Trilogy might come to mind in this breathtaking horror film with cerebral vibes and horrific murders. Stanley Kubrick once told the New York Times, "Man isn't a noble savage, he's an ignoble savage. He is irrational, brutal, weak, silly, unable to be objective about anything where his own interests are involved." That about sums it up. I'm interested in the brutal and violent nature of man because it's a true picture of him. And any attempt to create social institutions on a false view of the nature of man is probably doomed to failure. The new horror film In a Violent Nature is practically a tone poem about that quote, and has gotten a near-perfect score with critics as a result. In a Violent Nature sees a traditional, intentionally cliched horror film play out, except it situates the viewer in the perspective of the indifferent, relentless killer. You follow him in long over-the-shoulder tracking shots throughout Ontario's woodlands. The film is entirely set in the woods, only rarely breaking away. There aren't traditional scenes. It's more like someone attached a camera to Jason Voorhees to film a documentary. As such, there's a kind of slow pacing that might alienate a large chunk of the commercial population, but for the rest of those high-concept fanatics out there who can balance gory horror with the art of Werner Herzog or Carl Dreyer, you're in for an unrated treat. Yes, even the MPAA is no match for the horrific murders depicted here. In a Violent Nature is already abuzz with hype, with the slasher getting praised by critics for a number of bold and innovative choices, and rightfully so. Filmmaker Chris Nash has voiced his appreciation for the visually striking ways in which Terrence Malick and Gus Van Sant track their protagonists from behind, but with In a Violent Nature, we're instead trailing the so-called antagonist, known only as Johnny Ree Barrett. Aside from its ending, Nash's astounding feature only takes a break from following Johnny in rare instances: static establishing shots, dreamlike tracking shots. This includes a scene involving a circle of teenage pals, one of whom recounts with a thick New England accent the mythological tale of Johnny. His vengeful spirit is awoken whenever someone stumbles upon a certain locket in the woods and spurs Johnny to quite literally rise from the grave and murder anyone he happens to cross paths with. Of course, the teens take the locket, and Johnny hunts them down. Besides just a few sequences like this bonfire moment, which is reminiscent of the elegant opening credits scene in Jaws, we remain with Johnny throughout. As a result, we usually hear moments of dialogue from far off. The sound level of dialogue is directly proportional to the distance Johnny is from its source, which, combined with the camera's placement directly behind Johnny, situates you right in the killer's sensory experience. While other films have done this in tiny ways in order to implicate the audience for their salacious and violent desires, Peeping Tom, Funny Games, Salo, In a Violent Nature seems to have a different agenda. It's an artistic, thought-provoking device that refuses to give in to the temptation of impatient audiences out there who will say, "Just hurry up and get to the action already." Speaking of slow burn moments, it's impressive just how careful and patient Chris Nash is with the grisly death scenes in the film. In a Violent Nature may be one of the most artistic horror films in recent years, but it absolutely does not resist gruesome gore and disgusting deaths. There are two kill scenes in the film that instantly rank among the greatest deaths in horror history. One killer sequence involving a log splitter might leave some scratching their heads as to why exactly it continues for so long. Meanwhile, appreciators of slow cinema and film art will probably have no problem with its duration and might even draw a parallel to that incredibly long shot in A Ghost Story, 2017, where Rooney Mara's grieving character devours a pie. In a Violent Nature, director Chris Nash recently told us that he, in fact, wanted this scene to extend even longer. Maybe in the hypothetical sequel, which we'd happily welcome, In a More Violent Nature. Then there's another show-stopping moment, this time between Johnny and pending victim Aurora, Charlotte Crayon, another teenager who's performing yoga solo out on the lake, just on the outskirts of the woods that Johnny inhabits. He sneaks up on her, and she at first thinks he's a flirtatious friend who has been coming on to her. Once Aurora comes face to face with the weirdly masked Johnny, however, it's a dialogue-free moment that almost becomes beautiful in a way. But you may or may not end up shielding your eyes as one of the most gruesome deaths we've ever seen unfolds on the screen. What might be divisive to audiences, even the ones who can appreciate the slow poetry of In a Violent Nature, is the film's ending. It's hard to discuss without giving things away, but it feels like more of an epilogue from a different film. It breaks the aesthetic rules of the previous 80 minutes and possibly includes more dialogue, a monologue, really, in 10 minutes than all the speech in the rest of the film combined. It effectively stops the movie and says, here are the themes of the film and something to think about. Some people may like this ending. It's an anomaly in an iconoclastic film. It's a head-scratcher, and it could pave the way for a sequel, though that doesn't seem to be the filmmaker's intention. It also fills in some symbolic details for in a violent nature. By setting the entire film in the woods, and by limiting the audience's entry point to the killer himself, Nash creates a kind of coldly apathetic, objective, and practically God's eye view look at the violence of nature, both human and natural. By the end, you realize that the threat of violence is woven into the fabric of reality, and not just when we're being hunted by a killer. What's in a violent nature about? A title, explained. The title could thus be taken quite literally, with Nash placing the viewer in the violent nature of Ontario, with its little black flies. While the film has drawn comparisons to Malick and Gus Van Sant, it's actually Werner Herzog and his metaphysical pessimism who comes to mind the most at the end of In a Violent Nature. Herzog told Les Blanc at the end of his documentary, Burden of Dreams. Ultimately, In a Violent Nature is a disturbing meditation on the relentless indifference of nature and humanity. This blood-soaked nightmare of a film isn't for everyone. It is a deconstructed slasher movie, a sort of postmodern, or perhaps pre-modern, Friday the 13th that will appeal to cinephiles with strong stomachs and adventurous horror buffs alike. It's exciting to think about the kind of project Chris Nash will tackle next.